Between the time when the oceans drank Atlantis and the rise of the sons of Arius, there was an age undreamed of. And unto this, Conan, destined to bear the jeweled crown of Aquilonia upon a troubled brow. It is I, his chronicler, who alone can tell thee of his saga. Let me tell you of the days of high adventure.
Hello, dear listener, and welcome to another episode of Conan Chronicles. This is Dan, your host as always, and today we're going to be taking a look at the 15th Conan story in publication order, Beyond the Black River. This story was written by Mr. Robert E. Howard and first published across the May and June 1935 issues of Weird Tales magazine. Our story begins on the frontier of the Aquilonian Empire, the most powerful and prosperous kingdom of the Hyborian Age. Prior to the events of this story, the Aquilonians had embarked on a quest of colonial expansion to the west of their traditional borders. While they had found some success in settling these western lands and bringing civilization to the savage wilds, they had not won these territories easily. These lands were inhabited by a group of disparate native tribes known as the Picts. The Pictish people live as hunter-gatherers, much less civilized than their Aquilonian neighbors. But this did not stop the Picts from heavily impeding the Empire's expansion by the sword. At the time of this story, the Aquilonians had ventured beyond Thunder River and established the frontier province of Conajahara. While all of these conquests had been hard fought and held, Conajahara had suffered the most of any of the Aquilonian frontier holdings. The Aquilonians had pushed west, past Thunder River, all the way to the banks of the Black River. These lands were sacred to the Picts, and they could not forget that both the eastern and western banks of the Black River no longer belonged to them. The first character we meet is a young Aquilonian frontiersman named Balthus, walking through the treacherous forests of Conajahara, when a Pictish arrow soars out of the wood in his general direction, but misses him widely. Balthus darts behind a nearby bush to conceal himself, and watches as a colossal, muscle-bound figure strides out from where the arrow had been shot, his sword stained crimson. The man was clad in dark mesh mail and a helmet adorned with bull horns. The man looks in Balthus's direction and calls for him to come out now, as it's all safe. He had apparently slain the Pict, who was alone, traveling with none other of his kin. The stranger tells Balthus that he had wandered into dangerous territory, just 4 miles east of the Black River. He warns the settler that no one between the Aquilonian fort Tuscelan and the main Conajaharan settlement near, Velitrium, was safe from the wrath of the Picts. Balthus, impressed by the stranger's tracking and scouting skills which had allowed him to kill his would-be assassin, asks what exactly the stranger is doing in these woods.
You are one of the fort's garrison.
I am no soldier. I draw the pay and rations of an officer of the line.
but I do my work in the woods. Valanus knows I'm of more use ranging along the river than cooped up in the fort.
My name is Balthus,
He offered.
I was at Belitrium last night. I haven't decided whether I'll take up a hide of land or enter fort service.
The best land near Thunder River is already taken, grunted the Slayer. Plenty of good land between Scalp Creek, you crossed it a few miles back, and the fort. But that's getting too devilish close to the river. The Picts steal over to burn and murder, as that one did. They don't always come singly. Someday they'll try to sweep the settlers out of Kanajahara, and they may succeed. Probably will succeed. This colonization business is mad anyway. There's plenty of good land east of the Busconian marches. If the Aquilonians would cut up some of the biggest states of their barons and plant wheat where now only deer are hunted, they wouldn't have to cross the border and take the lands of the Picts away from them.
That's queer talk from a man in the service of the governor of Kanajahara,
objected Balthus. It's nothing to me, the other retorted. I'm a mercenary. I sell my sword to the highest bidder. I never planted wheat and never will, so long as there are other harvests to be reaped with the sword. But you Hyborians have expanded as far as you'll be allowed to expand. You've crossed the marches, burned a few villages, exterminated a few clans, and pushed back the frontier to the Black River. But I doubt if you'll even be able to hold what you've conquered. And you'll never push the frontier any further westward. Your idiotic king doesn't understand conditions here. He won't send you enough reinforcements, and there are not enough settlers to withstand the shock of a concerted attack from across the river.
but the Picts are divided into small clans, persisted Balthus. They'll never unite. We can whip any single clan.
Or any 3 or 4 clans, admitted the Slayer. But someday a man will rise and unite 30 or 40 clans, just as was done among the Cimmerians when the Gundermen tried to push the border northward years ago. They tried to colonize the southern marches of Cimmeria, destroyed a few small clans, built a fort town, Venarium. You've heard the tale.
So I have indeed,
replied Balthus, wincing. The memory of that red disaster was a black blot in the chronicles of a proud and warlike people.
My uncle was at Venarium when the Cimmerians swarmed over the walls. He was one of the few who escaped that slaughter. I've heard him tell the tale many a time. The barbarians swept out of the hills in a ravening horde, without warning, and stormed Venarium with such fury none could stand before them. Men, women, and children were butchered. Venarium was reduced to a mass of charred ruins, as it is to this day. The Aquilonians were driven back across the marches, and have never since tried to colonize the Cimmerian country. But you speak of Venarium familiarly. Perhaps you were there.
I was, grunted the other. I was one of the horde that swarmed over the walls. I hadn't yet seen 15 snows, but already my name was repeated about the council fires. Balthus involuntarily recoiled, staring. It seemed incredible that the man walking tranquilly at his side should have been one of those screeching, blood-mad devils that poured over the walls of Venarium that long-gone day to make her streets run crimson.
Then you too are a barbarian,
he exclaimed involuntarily. The other nodded, without taking offense. I am Conan, a Cimmerian.
After some more banter between them about Conan's barbarous past and his misgivings about Aquilonia and its civilized ways, the pair heads towards Fort Tuscelan, as it is getting dark, and it would not be advisable to travel the forests at night with the Picts about. As they journey in the general direction of the fort, a piercing cry of agony echoes through the forest. Conan draws his sword and swiftly races towards the source of the scream, with Balthus trailing behind, barely keeping pace with the wild man. By the time the pair finds the individual who had cried out, he's already dead. He was a portly and wealthy merchant. Just before he died, something had petrified him so thoroughly that his face was still frozen in an expression of sheer terror. His throat appears to be slashed from ear to ear by some demonic force. Conan suspects that it is a minion of the Pictish wizard, Zogar Sag, and the two carry the merchant's body back with them in the direction of the fort. The two make it about another mile before, this time, they hear the voice of a woman scream out in terror, and again, Conan leaps into action in search of a helpless victim. However, as the pair draws closer to the source of the noise, the scream shifts into a mocking laughter. Conan curses, wheels about, and sprints back the way they had came, as a monstrous creature, engulfed in blue witchfire, comes gliding out of the forest at them. Conan hurls his axe directly at this thing, and it seemingly disappears. Balthus asks Conan exactly what that was, and he tells him that it was a swamp demon. Apparently the Picts are not the only things that are dangerous for unsuspecting settlers in these woods. Conan and Balthus finally arrive at Fort Tuscelan, on the eastern bank of the Black River. This is the last bulwark of the Aquilonian invaders against the Picts, filled with the primal rage of a people who have had their homeland stolen from them.
There, at the fort, civilization ended. Fort Tuscelan was the last outpost of a civilized world. It represented the westernmost thrust of the dominant Hyborian races. Beyond the river, the primitive still reigned in shadowy forests. Bush-thatched huts where hung the grinning skulls of men, and mud-walled enclosures where fires flickered and drums rumbled, and spears were whetted in the hands of dark, silent men with tangled black hair and the eyes of serpents. Those eyes often glared through bushes at the fort across the river. Once dark-skinned men had built their huts where that fort stood. Yes, and their huts had risen where now stood the fields and log cabins of fair-haired settlers. Back beyond Velitrium, that raw, turbulent frontier town on the banks of Thunder River, to the shores of that other river that bounds the Busconian marches. Traders had come, and priests of Mitra who walked with bare feet and empty hands, and died horribly, most of them. But soldiers had followed, men with axes in their hands and women and children in ox-drawn wains. Back to Thunder River, and still back beyond Black River, the Aborigines had been pushed, with slaughter and massacre. But the dark-skinned people did not forget that once Canajohara had been theirs.
Within the fort, Conan and Balthus meet with the governor of Canajohara. The governor, like Conan, identifies the corpse of the merchant they had found in the woods as a man named Tiberius. Strangely enough, Tiberius had been in a dispute with the wizard Zogar Sag before he had turned up dead. This dispute had led to the wizard's capture previously by the Aquilonians, but he had used his wicked magic to escape their grasp. Conan remarks that the magic of the wizard will eventually overwhelm the settlers, as the civilized Aquilonians have nothing that can match such a powerful force. In the face of this reality, the governor becomes candid. He tells Conan that he has nothing but a skeleton crew for an army and a handful of scouts to defend Canajohara's borders. Foreign plagues, before unimagined by the Aquilonians, had swept through the ranks of the military and civilian populations, and the wildlife of the forests were just as dangerous as the Picts. Panthers and poisonous serpents prey upon the settlers with relative ease. Morale is so low amongst the soldiers that he has. There are whispers of desertion, and many of the settlers speak of regretting this journey they had made to the frontier territory of the Empire. The governor says that the only hope he sees for this colony, and the continued expansion of Aquilonian civilization westward, is the elimination of this wizard, Zogar Sag. He asks the Cimmerian if he will take a small band of men into Pictish territory to murder the wizard tonight, under the cover of darkness. Balthus volunteers himself for membership in Conan's party, to which the barbarian agrees, and they begin making preparations for their mission. By the time evening falls, Conan, Balthus, and the rest of his men venture out onto the waters of the Black River by canoe, crossing it to the western bank that the Picts still hold as their territory. Conan asks Balthus and another of the men in the party to wait in the canoe so that they may make a swift exit once the deed is done, and sprints with the rest of the men into the woods. For hours, Balthus and the man sit in silence, listening intently for any sign that they may be ambushed by a group of Picts. Eventually, Balthus hears a sound that resembles a large fish splashing in the water near the canoe, and the stern of the boat begins to slightly drift away from the western shore. Balthus turns to warn his fellow crewmen that he should retake control of the canoe, and notices that the man's throat had been sliced open from ear to ear, just like the merchant that Conan and he had found in the woods earlier. In an instant, Balthus is seized in the muscular arms of a man reaching out from the darkness, and something cracks against his head. The Aquilonian falls unconscious, and is dragged out of the canoe by a swarm of Picts. Balthus awakens some time later, bound to a post and surrounded by a large circle of Pictish warriors. Behind them, fires burn, and from tent shelters, Pictish women and children look on curiously. Balthus is frightened by his helpless position initially, but falls into a state of sheer horror when he shifts his gaze and finds a pyramid of severed heads, which he recognizes as the rest of Conan's crew stacked nearby. The only heads missing seem to be Conan's, and another man that Balthus notices is bound to a post next to him. Balthus whispers to the man and asks him how the Picts defeated Conan and his men. He says that the Picts had been watching them from the time they left the fort, and that Conan's party had walked directly into a trap. Arrows had rained from all sides once they had strolled into the woods on the western bank, and everyone except the captured man and Conan had been slaughtered. Conan had escaped out into the night, but the man had no idea what had become of him. The man looks about, and mutters that Pictish warriors from tribes much further to the west and further south down the Black River were gathered around them. He tells Balthus that Zogar Sag had likely united enough tribes to overwhelm even the more advanced military resources of the Aquilonians, and that Conajahara's doom was imminent. Then suddenly, out of a longhouse adorned with human skulls, the wizard himself comes.
Balthus saw a lean figure of middle height, almost hidden in ostrich plumes set on a harness of leather and copper. From amidst the plumes peered a hideous and malevolent face. With fantastic bounds and prancing, he entered the ring and whirled before his bound and silent captives. That ferocious face glaring out from the billowing mass gave the scene a grim significance. No man with a face like that could seem ridiculous or like anything except the devil he was. A tense silence regained as Zogar Sag turned towards the forest, raised on his tiptoes and sent a weird, inhuman call, shuddering out into the night. Somewhere, far out in the black forest, a deeper cry answered him. Balthus shuddered. From the timbre of that cry, he knew it never came from a human throat. He remembered what Vilanus had said, that Zogar boasted that he could summon wild beasts to do his bidding. Balthus felt the short hair stir on his scalp. The creature that stood in the gate was like the embodiment of nightmare legend. Its colour was of a curious, pale quality which made it seem ghostly and unreal by the dim light. But there was nothing unreal about the low-hung, savage head and the great, curved fangs that glistened in the firelight. On noiseless, padded feet, it approached like a phantom out of the past. It was a survivor of an older, grimmer age, the ogre of many an ancient legend, a saber-toothed tiger. No Hyborian hunter had looked upon one of those primordial brutes for centuries. The beast that glided toward the men on the stakes was longer and heavier than a common striped tiger, almost as bulky as a bear. Balthus no longer doubted the actuality of the shaman's magic. Only the black arts could establish a domination over that tiny-brained, mighty-thewed monster. The shaman stepped back. His hand waved towards the woodsman. The great cat sank into a crouch, and Balthus numbly remembered tales of its appalling ferocity. The shaman cried out shrilly, and with an ear-shattering roar, the monster sprang. Balthus had never dreamed of such a spring, such a hurtling of incarnated destruction embodied in that giant bulk of iron thews and rippling talons. Full on the woodsman's breast it struck, and the stake splintered and snapped at the base, crashing to the earth under the impact. The saber-tooth was gliding toward the gate, half dragging, half carrying a hideous crimson hulk that only faintly resembled a man. In that leap, the great beast had not only broken off the stake, it had ripped the mangled body of its victim from the post to which it was bound. The huge talons in that instant of contact had disemboweled and partly dismembered the man, and the giant fangs had torn away the whole top of his head, shearing through the skull as easily as through flesh. Balthus retched suddenly. He had hunted bears and panthers, but he had never dreamed the beast lived which could make such a red ruin of a human frame in the flicker of an instant.
As quickly as the saber-tooth had appeared, it vanishes back through the village gate and slinks into the darkness of the forest. The wizard once again calls out into the darkness beyond the gate, this time with a serpent-like hiss, and a hideous beast answers his call. A gigantic snake slithers out of the darkness, its head similar in size to that of a horse's head, and the front of its body standing as tall as a human. Balthus braces himself for his fate, when suddenly a spear flies out from the woods and digs deeply into the serpent's flesh. As the beast begins to convulse and writhe in pain, chaos ensues. The serpent turns on the Picts, thinking that one of them had wounded it. It begins spitting venom at them and disgorging those nearby with its massive tail. During the chaos, Balthus feels someone untie his wrists and then drag him off the post he had been tied to. The Aquilonian strains to see who had freed him, and to his relief, it is Conan. The Cimmerian tells Balthus that they must leave quickly before the Picts recover from their panic, and the two flee out into the darkness of the forest. In their flight, Conan tells Balthus that it would be suicide to try and flee back to the Black River, and says that their only option is to flee west, deeper into Pictish territory. The pair can hear the war cries of Pictish warriors on their trail close behind them, and they run as swiftly as their bodies will allow them on the forest path. They encounter a leopard, and later a panther, both under Zorag Sag's command, later on their journey. But Conan quickly disposes of them, using an axe to the skull on the leopard, and a ritual circle of an ancient god named Jebal Sag on the panther. The two continue on the forest path, hoping to evade the Picts until the morning, when they would give up on their pursuit and return to prepare for their raid on Conajahara. They successfully wait out the night, hiding amongst the cliffs of the forest, and rush towards Fort Tuscelan to warn the governor of the united Pict clans, ready to destroy the Aquilonians. They make it to the banks of the Black River, and are about to brave its rushing waters by swimming across, when a Pictish arrow flashes out of the woods at them.
Then, with a tigerish bound, Conan was through the bushes. Balthus caught the gleam of steel as he whirled his sword, and heard a death scream. A Pict with a shattered skull lay face down on the ground, his fingers spasmodically clawing at the grass. Half a dozen others were swarming about Conan, swords and axes lifted. Their lower jaws were painted white, contrasting vividly with their dark faces, and the designs on their muscular breasts differed from any Balthus had ever seen. He sprang up and glared wildly about for his companion, expecting to see him overwhelmed by numbers. Then he realized the full strength and ferocity of the Cimmerian. Conan bestrode two of his attackers, shorn half asunder by that terrible broadsword. As Balthus looked, he saw the Cimmerian beat down a thrusting short sword, avoid the stroke of an axe with a cat-like sidewise spring which brought him within arm's length of a squat savage stooping for a bow. Before the Pict could straighten, the red sword flailed down and clove him from shoulder to mid-breastbone, where the blade stuck. The remaining warriors rushed in, one from either side. Balthus hurled his axe with an accuracy that reduced the attackers to one, and Conan, abandoning his efforts to free his sword, wheeled and met the remaining Pict with his bare hands. The bone snapped loudly, and Balthus saw the Pict wince and falter. The next instant he was swept off his feet, lifted high above the Cimmerian's head. He writhed in midair for an instant, kicking and thrashing, and then was dashed headlong to the earth with such force that he rebounded and then lay still, his limp posture telling of splintered limbs and a broken spine.
Conan cries that they must hurry, or the Aquilonians are doomed, and the pair once again continues to sprint towards the fort. Eventually, a dog, fleeing from the Picts that Conan recognizes as one he had saved prior to the events of this story from a Pictish raid named Slasher, stumbles upon the pair in the forest. Conan and Balthus comfort the dog and decide to bring him with them. Eventually, they make it to the outskirts of the fort and already find it on fire near ruin. Conan tells Balthus that the fort is doomed. To rush into the Pictish horde at this time would only mean dying with the governor. He says that the only thing that can be done now is to warn the settlers to the east and try to evacuate as many of them as possible before the Picts march on their homes at Velitrium. As they race toward Velitrium, they see a pack of Picts ahead of them, who apparently couldn't wait for the fall of Tuscelan to massacre the helpless settlers. Conan, Balthus, and Slasher leap at the Picts, both afire with wrath and hatred, and make a red haze of the warriors. They continue along the path toward the village when they come to a fork, and Conan notices fresh wagon tracks leading down the path to the north. Conan looks down the path and tells Balthus that it appears some of the settlers had left this morning to mine salt at the deposits at the edge of the marshes. He tells Balthus that he will go after these settlers, and that Balthus should continue on the main path towards the village to warn them. So Balthus and Slasher continue alone toward Velitrium. When they arrive, they begin to rouse the settlers from their slumber. Night had fallen once again as Conan and Balthus had rushed back towards Conajahara. After Balthus makes it through a few of the cabins, and tells the settlers to flee. He hears a wolf-like yell echo out from the darkness behind him. He hastily tells the settlers to gather everyone else and flee, while he staves off the approaching Picts. With bow, axe, and his trusty new canine companion, Balthus manages to keep the Picts at bay long enough for a good portion of the village to escape the warriors' wrath. Meanwhile, Conan is sprinting towards the salt deposits. He eventually finds the settlers he had been looking for and tells them to flee. He stays back to cover their escape when some sort of presence emerges from the swamps.
A weird glow burned through the trees. It moved toward him, shimmering weirdly. A green witchfire that moved with purpose and intent. The quivering flame had a solid core. The flame was but a green garment that masked some animate and evil entity. But the Cimmerian was unable to make out its shape or likeness. Then, shockingly, a voice spoke to him from amidst the fiery column.
Why do you stand like a sheep, waiting for the butcher, Conan?
The voice was human, but carried strange vibrations that were not human.
Sheep?
Conan's wrath got the best of his momentary awe.
Do you think I'm afraid of a damn Pictish swamp devil?
Oh, fool. You have come far from the grey hills of Cimmeria to meet your doom in the forests of Kanajar.
You've had your chance at me before now,
Snorted Conan.
Why didn't you kill me then, if you could?
My brother had not painted a skull black for you, and hurled it into the fire that burns forever on Galah's black altar.
Who the devil is your brother?
Demanded Conan.
Zogar Sag, a child of Jebel Sag, who still visits his sacred groves at times. A woman of Gwawela slipped in the grove holy to Jebel Sag. Her babe was Zogar Sag. I too am a son of Jebel Sag, out of a fire being from a far realm. Zogar Sag summoned me out of the misty lands with incantations and sorcery and his own blood. He materialized me in the flesh of his own planet. We are one, tied together by invisible threads. His thoughts are my thoughts. If he is struck, I am bruised. If I am cut, he bleeds. But I have talked enough. Soon your ghost will talk with the ghosts of the Dark Land. And they will tell you of the old gods which are not dead, but sleep in the outer abysses. And from time to time, awake.
I'd like to see what you look like,
Muttered Conan, working his axe free.
you who leave a track like a bird, who burn like a flame, and yet speak with a human voice.
You shall see.
Answered the voice from the flame.
See, and carry the knowledge with you into the Dark Land.
The flames leapt and sank, dwindling and dimming. A face began to take shadowy form. At first Conan thought it was Zogar Sag himself, who stood wrapped in green fire. But the face was higher than his own, and there was a demonic aspect about it. Conan had noted various abnormalities about Zogar Sag's features. An obliqueness of the eyes, a sharpness of the ears, a wolfish thinness of the lips. These peculiarities were exaggerated in the apparition which swayed before him. The eyes were red as coals of living fire. More details came into view. A slender torso covered with snaky scales, which was yet manlike in shape, with manlike arms from the waist upward. Below, long, crane-like legs ended in splay, three-toed feet like those of a huge bird.
Along the monstrous limbs, the blue fire fluttered and ran. He saw it as through a glistening mist. Then suddenly, it was towering over him, though he had not seen it move toward him. A long arm, which for the first time he noticed was armed with curving, sickle-like talons, swung high and swept down at his neck. One flailing, talon-armed limb knocked his helmet from his head. A little lower, and it would have decapitated him. But fierce joy surged through him as his savagely driven sword sank deep in the monster's groin. He bounded backward from a flailing stroke, tearing his sword free as he leapt. He was inside the lashing arms and driving his sword deep in the monster's belly. Felt the arms lock about him, and the talons ripping the mail from his back as they sought his vitals. He was lapped and dazzled by blue flame that was chill as ice. Then he had torn fiercely away from the weakening arms, and his sword cut the air in a tremendous swipe. The demon staggered and fell, sprawling sideways, its head hanging only by a shred of flesh. The fires that veiled it leapt fiercely upward, now red as gushing blood, hiding the figure from view. A scent of burning flesh filled Conan's nostrils. Shaking the blood and sweat from his eyes, he wheeled and ran staggeringly through the woods.
Conan rushes through the forest towards Thunder River, and the chapter ends. The final chapter flashes forward to some time after the conflict is over. Conan is in a tavern, the lone survivor of Fort Tuscelan, sipping from a large glass of wine. Conan engages in conversation with a group of settlers, who tell Conan that they had witnessed the death of Zogar Sag. Apparently, the wizard had all of a sudden begun howling like a wounded animal, and then fell, gagging and frothing at the mouth before their very eyes. By the end of this fit, there were red marks like the wounds of a sword on his groin, belly, and neck. Inexplicably, his head was left hanging onto his body by a sliver of flesh that was once his neck. Apparently, what the swamp demon had told Conan about his unique connection with his brother was true. Conan's slaying of the demon had also killed Zogar Sag, once and for all. The men also lament the death of Balthus and Slasher, who had made their final stand to allow some settlers to escape Velitrium. They are spoken of as heroes. And then, the group begins discussing what may become of this Aquilonian Frontier and their quest to civilize the West.
They'll not rebuild the fort. No. Kanajahara has lost to Aquilonia. The frontier has been pushed back. Thunder River will be the new border. The woodsman sighed and stared at his calloused hand, worn from contact with axe haft and sword hilt. Conan reached his long arm for the wine jug. The forester stared at him, comparing him with the men about them, the men who had died along the lost river, comparing him to those other wild men over that river. Conan did not seem aware of his gaze. Barbarism is the natural state of mankind, the borderer said, still staring somberly at the Cimmerian. Civilization is unnatural. It is a whim of circumstance, and barbarism must always, ultimately triumph.
Beyond the Black River is a fascinating tale, and it's probably my favorite one from Howard yet. In this one, Howard spins a blend of the sword and sorcery genre with the American Western genre, as this is a clear analog, I think, to Howard's view and feelings on American westward expansion that saw the young nation continuing to colonize the lands of the Native Americans from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific. In the United States, there's sort of a mythological perception of the early colonial period and the settlement of the various colonies that eventually became our country. One of our national holidays, Thanksgiving, commemorates the Puritans who settled Plymouth, Massachusetts in the 1620s, sharing a celebratory feast with members of the Wampanoag tribe. These natives had helped the settlers by giving them food in a time of scarcity the year before, and had offered them protection against their rival, the Narragansett tribe. While this is a real event, it's hardly indicative of the way that the United States conducted relations with the natives of the North American continent throughout its history. Violent conflicts with the natives, who often didn't take kindly to settlers encroaching upon their land, goes all the way back to the literal first settlements English people made on this continent. Jamestown, Virginia, which is known of by many Americans through the lens of the Walt Disney Corporation's Pocahontas film, was one of the first settlements in North America by English settlers, the primary progenitors of the United States and its culture. The Disney film does portray a conflict between the natives and the English settlers, but romanticizes the real events, in my mind, to an extremely stupid and damaging degree. In the real world, Jamestown was founded in very close proximity to the territory of the Powhatan Confederacy, an Algonquin Native American nation. The settlers landed at Jamestown in 1607, and raids on the settlement by natives occurred almost immediately. The natives did not appreciate these settlers, who had come to Virginia during a historic drought and settled in a swamp ill-fitted for agriculture, expanding their territory to native lands for the purposes of increasing crop yields. The settlers saw this as something that was necessary, as the colony suffered from long periods of famine and outbreak of disease that almost doomed the colony multiple times. During one particularly potent famine, 2/3 of the colony's population died of starvation. In 1609, just 2 years after Jamestown had been established, full-scale war between the natives and the settlers broke out that lasted for 5 years. What would come to be known as the First Anglo-Powhatan War was brought to an end via the Peace of Pocahontas in the year 1614. 2 years prior to the war's end, Pocahontas, the daughter of the Powhatan Confederacy's chief, had been kidnapped by the English settlers and held for ransom so that peace could be negotiated. The final peace agreement to end the war was sealed with a marriage arranged between Pocahontas and a wealthy colonist who had made his fortune farming tobacco in Virginia, named John Rolfe. In addition to her marriage, Pocahontas was forced to convert to Christianity and change her name to Rebecca. This was a short-lived marriage and peace, however, because 3 years later, in 1617, Pocahontas took ill after traveling to England with her husband and died. Relations quickly deteriorated, and another series of wars broke out between the English settlers and the natives, known as the Second and Third Anglo-Powhatan Wars, that took place from 1622 to 1632 and 1644 to 1646, respectively. One of the darkest moments in English colonial history in North America took place on March 22, 1622, when Powhatan warriors invaded Jamestown and murdered 347 people, roughly 1/3 of the settlement's population at that time. This event would come to be known as the Indian Massacre of 1622. Jamestown was far from the only European colonial venture that had prolonged, bloody conflicts with the natives, however. These wars between the Native Americans and European settlers looking to establish new nations persisted from the time the Europeans arrived here in the 17th century until the early 20th century. The final armed conflicts between the natives and the United States government took place in 1924, when the last raid of U.S. territory by the Apache was suppressed and the Apache Wars were brought to a close. One of the primary drivers of American imperial expansion to the west, the displacement and eventual near extermination of the Native American population, was an invention of American political ideology that came to be called Manifest Destiny. Manifest Destiny was the idea that American civilization and the values which underpinned it were special, virtuous, and holy. Therefore, it should be the divinely ordained mission of the American nation to expand its civilization across the wild, untamed North American continent and, quote, redeem it by creating a paradise on earth, a mighty empire with freedom and democracy as its most valued institutions. These ideas that emphasize the exceptionalism of America and its culture go all the way back to the founding of the American colonies. Most of the settlers of these colonies that would unite to become America believed that the settling of this continent presented an opportunity to remake the world and provide the old European world with a shining example as to how a better society may be created. The most eloquent expression of this idea was given in a sermon by one of the Massachusetts Bay Colony's founders, John Winthrop, when he referred to his virtuous settlement as a shining city upon a hill. This sentiment was echoed by many of the nation's founding fathers when they sought to rally other colonists to their cause as a ragtag group of revolutionaries many years later. Thomas Paine, in his famous pamphlet Common Sense, which was one of the most widely disseminated writings of the American Revolution, once wrote this about the idea of American exceptionalism. Quote, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again. A situation similar to the present hath not happened since the days of Noah until now. The birthday of a new world is at hand, and a race of men, perhaps as numerous as all of Europe contains, are to receive their portion of freedom from the events of a few months." By the time the United States became a nation and quickly expanded its borders all the way to the Rocky Mountains in the west with President Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase in 1803, Manifest Destiny began to motivate American settlers to expand the empire even further, all the way to the Pacific Ocean to the west. This was hardly a consensus at the time amongst American political elites. Ideological friends of Andrew Jackson in the Southern-dominated Democratic Party that he founded were unified proponents of this idea, while their opposition, the Whigs and later Republicans from the North, were divided on this issue. The division amongst the more northern-dominated political movements in the United States didn't come from any sort of sympathy for the natives, however. Their main concern was that the expansion of the American empire westward would also mean the expansion of the institution of slavery to even more territories across the nation. At this time, the abolitionist movement was beginning to come into full swing in the American North. Whigs and Republicans wanted to focus on the further development of American territories already held, namely, by limiting the amount of slave states in the Union so that the institution would become obsolete and eventually die out. However, Andrew Jackson and his allies in the Democratic Party used their power to expand suffrage to everyone who was a white male in the nation over the age of 21, not just wealthy property owners. With the support of this entirely new working-class voter base, the Democrats ushered in what came to be known as the era of Jacksonian democracy in the United States for an entire generation. The Democrats remained the dominant political force in the United States during that time, and used their power to implement the Manifest Destiny agenda. Under the Jackson and subsequent Jacksonian Democratic administrations, the Indian Removal Act forced Native Americans ever westward, as they were forcibly removed by American military forces from their ancestral homelands. What came to be known as the Trail of Blood and Tears saw Native American tribes within the territories already conquered by the United States trudge 16 miles a day to the west. The natives who complied suffered from famine and disease on what was effectively a death march, reminiscent of the Nazi death marches of Jews during the Holocaust, to lands designated as Indian Territory by the United States government. The tribes who did not comply with American demands to remove were ruthlessly attacked and hunted down by U.S. military forces. Many of the tribes attempted to resist and even held out for a while, but as we know just by living in a time after these struggles have concluded, however, the United States was the ultimate victor. Studies suggest that the Native American population in what is the modern United States declined sharply post-contact with colonial European powers. Estimates of the territorial United States native population pre-European contact vary widely, but modern studies seem to suggest that this number hovered somewhere between 15 and 5.65 million people. By the 1890s, after the era of Manifest Destiny, U.S. Census data determined that the Native American population in the United States had declined to 250,000. Many of these wars of American expansion in the early colonial and Manifest Destiny periods between the natives and the U.S. Army were disputes over key resource points, and in particular, rivers. Rivers were extremely important holdings for the inland territories of the fledgling American Empire, as they were used for transport of goods and people across these vast territories, in addition to being a freshwater resource in and of themselves. There were countless conflicts along the key rivers of what became the inland United States, but one of the most illuminating of these conflicts that I suspect Howard may have been looking at when writing this story is the struggle for the control of the Ohio River. The territory that is today called the Ohio River Valley was once the birthplace of many Native American civilizations. For thousands of years, tribes like the Omaha, the Ponca, and the Kaw people lived along the Ohio River, as it was a major trading route for the people who lived along it and the nearby Mississippi River. The colonial power that dominated the Ohio River Valley initially was France, but after the French and Indian War, control of this territory was ceded to the British Empire and their 13 colonies. Colonial elites, like George Washington, for example, began purchasing land grants in the Ohio River Valley, and English settlers began pouring into the valley, displacing the natives who lived there. Eventually, a treaty was struck with the natives by the British government in 1768 that designated the Ohio River as the dividing line between British and native territory. To this day, the borders of the American states of Kentucky and West Virginia lie across this line as negotiated shortly before the American Revolution. During the American Revolutionary War, many of the natives allied with the British military, hoping to drive American settlers out of the Ohio River Valley, who wished to expand the border even further, much to the chagrin of the British government. However, once the revolution ended in an American victory, the newly independent American government was deep in debt and began to nullify native claims to the lands north of the Ohio River to American settlers in order to cover its debts. The American government informed the natives that the land to the north of the Ohio River no longer belonged to them by right of conquest, and sought to impose treaty conditions on the natives confirming this, with no native involvement in these negotiations or terms. This encroachment and attempted seizure of their lands caused the Native Americans of the territories northwest of the Ohio River to form a united confederacy with the goal of resisting American settlements. The town of Marietta and its nearby Fort Harmar were the first settlements made north of the Ohio River by the Americans, very similar to Fort Tuscelan and Velitrium's placement along the Black River in this story. The natives were invited there initially to try and come to some sort of compromise after their anger at the settler invasion, but negotiations broke down quickly. In 1786, a 9-year war broke out between the Americans and the Native Confederacy that came to be known as the Northwest Indian War. The natives began raiding into the state of Kentucky, killing, kidnapping, and torturing settlers in an effort to make an example of those who may have thought to expand the American border even further north, beyond the Ohio River as previously negotiated. In 1790, the newly elected first president of the United States, George Washington, responded to these native raids by organizing a band of local state militiamen under the command of U.S. Army General Josiah Harmar to invade the territory north of the Ohio River and snuff out the native threat to American expansion once and for all. Harmar's campaign into these territories was waged primarily against native towns. 5 of them were raided and completely destroyed. But by the end, the Americans found themselves caught in an ongoing quagmire of a war. The natives suffered heavy casualties, but were successful in keeping the American forces from doing any lasting damage to their united Confederacy. After 183 of the approximately 1,400 Americans that had marched north of the Ohio River had been killed or went missing, and the campaign had dragged on with little progress for an entire year, the Harmar campaign ended in an embarrassing defeat. This failure was widely perceived as a national humiliation for the United States, and General Harmar's military career was destroyed by it. To take Harmar's place, President Washington appointed General Arthur St. Clair as the new military commander in charge of this matter in the Ohio River Valley the next year, and another campaign was launched to destroy the natives. As the campaign dragged on, food shortages and a lack of progress against the natives led to a plummet in morale amongst St. Clair's men. Desertion became common amongst them, just as it was amongst Governor Valanis's men in beyond the Black River, for similar reasons. The St. Clair campaign also ended in embarrassment and defeat for the United States, when 2 of the Native Confederacy's most fearsome war chiefs, Blue Jacket and Little Turtle, ambushed the American forces with a warrior band of more than 1,000 men. The Americans were slaughtered. 630 men were killed and 250 were wounded in the attack. The natives suffered only 21 deaths and 41 wounded. Arthur St. Clair kept his position as the governor of this northwest territory that the United States sought to conquer, but was sacked from his post as military commander in the region. Over the next 3 years, the American government kept committing more and more resources to the war effort to no avail, while simultaneously trying to negotiate with the natives to expand the American border north of the Ohio River. In the face of these war conditions and the attempted negotiations by the Americans, the Native Confederacy held a hard and united line. The Americans would not be allowed to settle beyond their current holdings south of the Ohio. The natives appealed to the British Empire, who they had been trading with for weapons and supplies during the war, for more direct assistance in the form of military intervention on their behalf. The British still held some colonial territories to the north of the United States border in Canada at the time, so it may have been possible if they wished to intervene. However, the British refused on the grounds that they wished to remain neutral in this conflict and retain non-hostile relations with the United States. After native forces suffered major defeats in 1794 at the Battle of Fort Recovery and the Battle of Fallen Timbers, distrust amongst the native tribes of the Confederacy grew. After these defeats, a united fighting force was never again able to be mustered to resist American expansion beyond the Ohio River. In the face of the Native Confederacy being shattered by internal divisions, the United States and the British Empire negotiated a series of treaties to end the conflict, a conflict that the British government had little involvement in, and natives were not even consulted regarding the terms of these agreements. These treaties saw the British relinquish some of their land claims in the northwestern frontier, recognize the United States as the primary military power in this region, gave the right of freedom of movement for natives in American and British territories, and pushed the American border beyond the Ohio River to the north. This war proved to be the last great movement of united native resistance to American expansion to the west in the nation's history. While the native populations resisted the United States all the way into the early 20th century on a continuing basis, they were never able to unite a large group of tribes such as the Confederation that existed during the Northwest Indian Wars ever again. In Beyond the Black River, we see the Picts, who are very clearly based on the Native Americans of the Western frontier in visual design and culture, mounting a movement of united resistance against the Aquilonians, who had pushed beyond a prior river boundary of their empire on Thunder River, all the way to the banks of the Black River, the other side of which is held by the Picts. A border fort, like the American Fort Harmar, stands at this river border to stem the tide of the Pictish horde from spilling over into Velitrium, the Aquilonian settlement at the edge of the frontier. The Aquilonian political leadership, like President Washington's administration, the American military, and the American Congress, proved to be ineffectual and unable to perceive what it would take to hold their frontier territory along the Black River, let alone expand it. In Beyond the Black River, the uniting force amongst these Pictish tribes is a charismatic shaman, Zogar Sag, who persuades tribes from across the Pictish-held lands to come together and form a mighty army to drive the Aquilonians out of the Black River Valley entirely. In the American and Native context, the person who initiated the formation of the Native Confederacy was a man named Joseph Brant, a native who was educated in a Connecticut native charity school and was one of the most infamous native leaders of the time. He was a political and military leader of the Mohawk tribe, who used the skills he had gained from a European education to fight against the Americans, beginning with the American Revolution, where he lent his assistance to the British during the Revolutionary War. Other native leaders were certainly important to this cause, including tribal war chiefs I mentioned previously, such as Blue Jacket and Little Turtle, but the Native Confederacy of the War for the Ohio River was also initiated by a charismatic and brilliant native political leader. The historical parallels with American history that Howard creates in Beyond the Black River are striking, and make the themes that he plays with here, the futility of imperial ventures and colonialism, the struggle between civilization and barbarism, and the racist implications of such conflicts, even more pertinent. As an American myself who loves reading about the history of my country, this story resonated with me more than any of the other Conan stories thus far, and, that's saying quite a bit. These stories are great. This story presents the conflict between the Picts and the Aquilonians from two different perspectives initially. We see this conflict through both the eyes of Balthus and the Aquilonians who speak with Conan over a jug of wine at the end of the story, which is a perspective similar to that of the American settlers of the 18th century, as they tried to conquer the Ohio River Valley. The Aquilonians see the native Picts as a band of wild and frightening savages from an alien culture they view as inferior to theirs. Whenever we see the Picts in this story through the eyes of an Aquilonian, they view the Pictish culture as brutal, primitive, and unworthy of existence in the face of Aquilonia's grand, civilized culture. This was a commonly held and long-held belief amongst American elites and regular citizens alike. This was, and still is, a commonly held belief amongst American elites and regular citizens alike. Let me demonstrate this by reading you some quotes from some of the most famous Americans of the 18th and 19th centuries. In 1779, George Washington said this, when writing to American General John Sullivan about what should be done with the natives in American territory and beyond on the North American continent. Quote, "The immediate objectives are the total destruction and devastation of their settlements and the capture of as many prisoners of every age and sex as possible. It will be essential to ruin their crops in the ground and prevent their planting more." Washington also said this in 1783 in a letter to James Duane, a fellow American Revolutionary leader, founding father, and politician. Quote, "I am clear in my opinion that policy and ceremony point very strongly to the expediency of being upon good terms with the Indians, and the propriety of purchasing their lands in preference to attempting to drive them by force of arms out of their country. which, as we have already experienced, is like driving out the wild beasts of the forest, which will return as soon as the pursuit is at an end, and then fall perhaps on those that are left there. When the gradual extension of our settlements will as certainly cause those savage as the wolf to retire, both being beasts of prey, though they differ in shape. In his autobiography, published in 1791, Benjamin Franklin said this of using alcohol as a means of eliminating the native population from land coveted by the United States. Quote, "And indeed, if it be the design of Providence to extirpate these savages in order to make room for cultivators of the earth, it seems not improbable that rum may be the appointed means. It has already annihilated all the tribes who formerly inhabited the seacoast." Thomas Jefferson wrote this in 1813 of the Native Americans. Quote, "This unfortunate race, whom we had been taking so much pains to save and civilize, have by their unexpected desertion and ferocious barbarities justified extermination, and now await our decision to their fate." James Monroe, founding father and 5th President of the United States, wrote this in a letter to then General Andrew Jackson of the U.S. Army in 1817. Quote, "The hunter or savage state requires a greater extent of territory to sustain it than is compatible with the progress and just claims of civilized life, and must yield to it. There is nothing more certain than, if the Indian tribes do not abandon that state and become civilized, that they will decline and become extinct. The hunter state, though maintained by warlike spirits, presents a feeble resistance to the more dense, compact, and powerful population of civilized man." In his 1833 annual message to Congress, then President Andrew Jackson said this on the nation's relations with the natives. Quote, "My original convictions upon this subject have been confirmed by the course of events for several years, and experience is every day adding to their strength. That those tribes cannot exist surrounded by our settlements and in continual contact with our citizens is certain. They have neither the intelligence, the industry, the moral habits, nor the desire of improvement which are essential to any favorable change in their condition. Established in the midst of another and superior race, and without appreciating the causes of their inferiority or seeking to control them, they must necessarily yield to the force of circumstances and ere long disappear." Most of the other presidents and statesmen, regardless of political party, held similar views in the early days of the American Republic. There are other quotes I thought about including, but I think you get the idea from those ones. This is the view of the Aquilonian settlers with regard to the Picts. By their civilized, quote, advancement over the nomadic, hunter-gatherer tribal societies of the various Pictish groups, they are entitled to settle the ancestral homelands of these Picts and do anything necessary to secure them from these people that they view as savages. Conan has a decidedly different view. He is not a Pict, but he is a Cimmerian. He was raised in a society with many similarities to the Picts. The Cimmerians also organized themselves in small hunter-gatherer tribes in the frozen lands of the north. Conan recalls to Balthus, upon their first meeting in the story, the confrontation that the Cimmerians had with the Aquilonians when they attempted to conquer their lands. The Cimmerians, whom the Aquilonians also perceive as savages, drove the Aquilonians out of their lands and prevented the Empire from establishing any permanent settlements there. While Conan has no particular love for the Picts as a people, and serves the Aquilonians because they're willing to pay him to act as a frontier warrior scout in their colonization effort, he doesn't view the Aquilonian quest to settle and civilize the Pictish lands the same way that they do. He sees this civilizing mission as sheer insanity. He tells Balthus that if the Aquilonian elites were willing to more evenly divide the lands that they already held, and use them to cultivate resources that they claim to need the Pictish land for, there would be no need for this bloody war against the Picts. He also tells Balthus that the political leaders of the Empire are out of touch, and are unwilling to engage in a full-scale war against the Picts, which is the only thing that will cease these continuous raids of destruction on Aquilonian settlements along the colonial border. These Picts had lived in these forests for thousands of years. No measures but driving these people to the brink of extinction would stop them from attempting to remove the Aquilonian usurpers from their homes. There is no way to peacefully and amicably steal someone's home from them. The only thing that will result from such a mission of imperialism and domination is perpetual conflict and death. The Aquilonians, like the Americans, tried at first to send missionaries into the native lands to convert them to their civilized ways of life, and these efforts failed. People usually don't take kindly to outsiders coming into their home, telling them that their culture, customs, and traditions are inferior to theirs, and recommending that they change everything about their families, communities, and nations. If the Aquilonians are not prepared to marshal the full military might of the Empire against the Picts, which during the events of this story they are not, Conan tells Balthus that their efforts are doomed to fail, just as the initial efforts of the Americans did in the war for the Ohio River Valley. Furthermore, such a quest to murder the Picts out of existence in these lands is an act of such barbarism. What really is the difference between the Aquilonians and the Picts anyways, if the Aquilonians still believe themselves to be so high and mighty a moral authority? By the end of the story, Balthus sacrifices himself in an effort to defend his kin from the Pictish horde that swept through their border settlements on a quest for vengeance against these usurpers. After being forced to retreat, the Aquilonians see the result of their attempts to civilize a people and territory they had little understanding of. Their border was pushed back, the Empire defeated and humiliated by these people the Aquilonians thought themselves to be highly superior to, and their idea of a destiny to stretch their noble, civilizing culture across the lands of the Hyborian Age shattered, shown to be a mere illusion of an arrogant and decadent people. The final scene of the story sees a group of once optimistic settlers turned cynical by seeing their villages burned and their kin slaughtered, talking to Conan and agreeing with the sentiment that he had expressed to Balthus at the beginning of the story. They tell Conan that barbarism is the natural state of mankind. Civilization, unnatural, a mere whim of historical circumstance. Once those circumstances that facilitate the creation of civilization erode over time and fade away, mankind's true nature, barbarism, makes a triumphant return. This idea is one of the central themes of Howard's Conan stories, that civilization is on a cyclical course. One tribe wrenches itself out of the nasty and brutish conditions of barbarous existence, rises to a level of power and decadence before unimagined, and then has an unceremonious decline, resulting in the fall of that civilization back to their former state of savagery. This is the Howard story that most thoroughly explores this theme that I've gotten to thus far in this series, and it's definitely the reason why it has become my favorite of the Howard stories thus far. While the Aquilonians primarily take inspiration from the Roman Empire in culture and position in the Hyborian Age world, casting them in the role of 18th century Americans fighting Native Americans on the Ohio River Valley frontier is in my mind a stroke of brilliance. After all, the United States has always sought to cast itself in the mold of Rome as the civilizing imperial force of the modern world, just as ancient Rome was when it ruled the Mediterranean world thousands of years before. The American exceptionalism myth, the idea that American culture is the most advanced ever conceived and is the ideal way for societies to be structured, has fueled the American Empire's expansion in territory and power to the point where we have become the most powerful imperial force in the recorded history of mankind, eclipsing the global reach and power of any empire before the United States. This idea posits that the American Empire will be everlasting, and that this civilizing mission will eventually overcome cultures and societies that America sees as its enemies that stand in the way of its mission. But we are not immune from the tides of history, nor the nature of mankind. The United States is a very young nation. All empires must end. And just because we have not seen an end to our ability to dominate the globe yet, this does not mean that the end is not imminent someday. It may be a decade from now. It may be a century from now. It may even be 1,000 years from now. I can't pretend to know. But there may come a day when American culture is viewed as a backwards, savage culture by some future advanced people. They may view us as the inferior culture in need of extermination from the annals of history to make way for their glorious conquest. If that day ever comes, it may be wise for Americans to reflect on the way that we have viewed ourselves and the horrifying things that we've done to build the country that we enjoy the fruits of today. We would be wise to learn from the historical record and refrain from embarking on these mad adventures of imperialism and colonialism, as Conan refers to them. In my lifetime, the United States embarked on yet another of these ventures. In the wake of the September 11th attacks, the second Bush administration declared an intent to destroy the savage government of Iraq and build it into a beacon of civilized democracy in a region of the world fraught with cultures that people of the United States see as alien to their own ways of life. This effort has seen the same results as the initial American wars of conquest in the Ohio River Valley, an unending quagmire that accomplished little, resulted in unprecedented death and destruction, and ultimately saw the United States withdraw from this conflict in embarrassment. A mighty empire that was shown the grim reality of its limited ability to shape the world in its own image. We should learn from such things, as the Aquilonians did when they too were shown this grim reality at the end of a blood-stained Pictish axe. Alright, so on that note, we've come to the end of my review and retrospective on Beyond the Black River. Needless to say, I would highly recommend this story. It gives you a lot of things to think about. It's the most American of the Conan stories I've read thus far, and as an American, the themes that Howard plays with in this one resonated with me to a profound degree. I suspect that many Americans may feel the same way upon reading it. I'd like to thank every single one of you for watching. I can't express in words how much it means to me that you take the time to listen to the videos I make, but before I let you go, I'd like to say a few words regarding how you can experience this story yourself and show some support for the show if you feel so inclined. I've included a link to a free audiobook of Beyond the Black River in the description below. This one is by the Cybrarian. You heard the voice of the man from that YouTube channel excerpted in this video. He does a wonderful job with all of the Conan stories that he's done, so please check out his stuff for this story and all of his other Conan readings, and show him some love as well. They seem like a really great channel and do great work. If you enjoyed the video, it would mean so much to me if you subscribed to the channel, liked this video, and posted your thoughts on this story, my video, or anything Conan related in the comments below. Millions of videos get uploaded here every day, so it can be difficult to cut through the noise. But YouTube promotes videos that get lots of likes, views, and comments, so it would help quite a bit if you did any of those things. I've also set up a Patreon for Conan Chronicles where you can support the show monetarily. Any amount you can chip in really helps, but if you pledge at the $5 tier or above, you get access to the Grog House podcast, which is my Patreon exclusive off-the-cuff Conan discussion podcast that I do with my very good friend Josh. I think it was last week I put up our commentary track for the 1982 Conan the Barbarian movie, which we also did with our very good friend Austin. The response to that episode has been pretty good so far. People seem to be enjoying it. So if you'd like to get to hear that, definitely subscribe to the Patreon. This month, I'm also going to be putting up a commentary track for the second Conan movie, Conan the Destroyer. So keep on the lookout for that. There'll be a 10-minute preview for free on the regular YouTube channel here, and then the full track will be available on Patreon for people who subscribe at the $5 tier or above. So check it out. Conan Chronicles is also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, so if you never want to miss an episode, get updates on the show, and see some awesome pieces of Conan artwork, check out those pages. I've also started collecting the Marvel Comics Conan the Barbarian series in single issues. I've been going back and buying all of the vintage stuff going all the way back to the 70s. Currently, I have issues 1 through 12 on hand, and I've been posting pictures of my issues as I get them. I have to make a new post that shows off some of the newer ones that I just got in. But if you'd like to keep up and with my collecting, I suppose, and kind of see all of the cool covers from the vintage Marvel series by Barry Windsor Smith and John Buscema and all the other artists that worked on Conan back then, definitely check out the Instagram page for that as well. Also, for those who haven't seen it yet, I uploaded a trailer to the channel for the first ever Conan Chronicles spin-off series, and the name of that show is John Carter, The Journals of Barsoom. That show's going to be a 12-part miniseries on all of the Edgar Rice Burroughs John Carter of Mars stories, which I thought would be a fun diversion from the Conan stuff for people that are interested in it. It's sort of in the same vein as the pulpy kind of writing you get from Conan, but instead of a high fantasy sword and sorcery thing, it's science fiction / science fantasy in the same vein as something like Star Wars. The show's going to be almost exactly the same format as this show. It's going to be scripted. It's going to include audiobook excerpts where I summarize the story and then have an analysis after that. I'm going to do the same level of editing to the degree that I can. Not every single one of those stories has received a comic book adaptation, so it might not have as directly representative a visual component as this show does, but it's going to be very similar. So if you're at all interested in pulp science fiction, I think you're going to like that show. But don't worry, the Conan stuff's still going to be coming. It's not like I'm going to stop for 12 episodes and not do anything Conan during that time. It's going to be kind of a supplemental show. I'm trying to, with this channel, promote cool, pulpy genre fiction that I think is a bit underappreciated. Conan is obviously the bread and butter of the channel, and my favorite of this kind of pulp fiction. I wouldn't call it a genre, maybe a style of writing, I guess. But I'm really excited to also dive headfirst into the science fiction realm of this pulp fiction fantasy writing, which John Carter is the kind of granddaddy of. You don't get Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers, Star Wars, even things like Superman and James Cameron's Avatar without John Carter. It's very, very influential. So if you're into any of that kind of stuff, I think you'll enjoy that show. I also have another spin-off show in the works that will also cover the kind of crime noir pulp fiction stuff. My favorite character of that ilk. If the John Carter show is successful, I'm going to do one on him as well. So if you'd like to see more of that kind of stuff, definitely support both this show and the John Carter stuff when it comes out. And I just hope you guys enjoy all of the content that's coming. With all of that said, I'd very much like to invite you, dear listener, to join me for the next episode. In the next show, we're going to be taking a look at the 16th Conan story in publication order, The Man-Eaters of Zambula. Until next we meet, dear listener, I bid you farewell.
Milanus wanted a fort built at the mouths of North and South Creeks, grunted the Cimmerian. Then the river could be patrolled constantly. But the government wouldn't do it. Soft-bellied fools, sitting on velvet cushions with naked girls offering them iced wine on their knees. I know the breed. They can't see any farther than their palace wall. Diplomacy. Hell, they'd fight Picts with theories of territorial expansion. Valanus and men like him have to obey the orders of a set of damn fools. They'll never grab any more Pictish land, any more than they'll ever rebuild Venarium. The time may come when they'll see the barbarians swarming over the walls of the eastern cities. A week before, Balthus would have laughed at any such preposterous suggestion. Now, he made no reply. He had seen the unconquerable ferocity of the men who dwelt beyond the frontiers. The barbarians' eyes were smouldering with fires that never lit the eyes of men bred to the ideas of civilization. In that instant, he was all wild, and had forgotten the man at his side. In his burning gaze, Balthus glimpsed and vaguely recognized pristine images and half-embodied memories. Shadows from life's dawn, forgotten and repudiated by sophisticated races. Ancient, primeval phantasms, unnamed and nameless. Balthus looked at his companion with admiration. I knew you hadn't spent your life on this frontier. You mentioned several far places. You've traveled widely. I've roamed far. Farther than any other man of my race ever wandered. I've seen all the great cities of the Hyborians, the Shemites, the Stygians, and the Hyrcanians. I've roamed in the unknown countries south of the black kingdoms of Kush, and east of the Sea of Vilayet. I've been a mercenary captain, a corsair, a Cossack, a penniless vagabond, a general. Hell, I've been everything except a king of a civilized country, and I may be that before I die. The fancy pleased him, and he grinned heartily. Conan was as much a part of this wilderness as Balthus was alien to it. The Cimmerian might have spent years among the great cities of the world. He might have walked with the rulers of civilization. He might even achieve his wild whims someday and rule as king of a civilized nation. Stranger things had happened. But he was no less a barbarian. He was concerned only with the naked fundamentals of life. The warm intimacies of small, kindly things, the sentiments and delicious trivialities that make up so much of civilized men's lives were meaningless to him. A wolf was no less a wolf because a whim of chance caused him to run with the watchdogs. Bloodshed and violence and savagery were the natural elements of the life Conan knew. He could not and would never understand the little things that are so dear to civilized men and women.